This year, 2020, started with such great hope. People talked about the 2020 vision, that we would see this great move of God and we would have this vision for what He would do in the future, and this was going to be one of these hinge years. But all of that hope and all of that excitement has been interrupted by a global pandemic that has caused a financial crisis. And now, unrelated to that, there are global moves happening that have to do with racial injustices, class tensions, political strife and opposition, depending on where in the world you're looking. But there are these eruptions of people movements happening all over the world. So what happened to the hope of this 2020 vision year? It was supposed to be so encouraging, but it's not really turned out that way so far. I want to talk about the idea of 2020 vision for just a moment. Some people wrongly suppose that 2020 vision is perfect vision. They look at it, maybe you've been to the eye doctor and you've looked at what's called the Snellen chart. It's when they back you up to 20 feet, or some places maybe at 6 meters, and there are letters on there. And what 2020 vision means is if you're 20 feet from the Snellen chart, you can see what the average person can also see at 20 feet. So it's not perfect vision, but it's average. 2010 would be better than 2020 in some ways. 2010 would mean you go to 20 feet and you can see what most people have to get up to 10 feet in order to see. 2040 vision would be much worse, meaning that you can see from 20 what other people can see from 40. You have to get twice as close to see it. My hope is that the text we want to look at today will help you see the right vision for the second half of 2020. My hope is, as we go deep in this text, that what we'll see will help us see the rest of this year and beyond, not just with average vision, but with God vision, to see it the way God wants us to see it. I want to look at a familiar scripture, very familiar scripture, Lamentations chapter 3, verses 22, 23, and 24. Here's what it says. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will hope in Him. Some of these are very familiar words, but where they're tucked into Lamentations says a lot, maybe as much as what these words actually say. Lamentations, of course, has 5 chapters, and 4 of those chapters are acrostics. Chapters 1 and 2 have 22 verses. Chapters 4 and 5 have 22 verses. Chapter 3, right in the middle, has 66 verses. Here's what this looks like. Chapter 1 has 1 verse for each letter, like A, B, C, D, but the Hebrew alphabet. Chapter 2 is the same. Now chapter 3 has 3 lines for each letter, thus 66 verses. Then it goes back to the 22 verses in chapter 4. But chapter 5, while it has 22 verses, it's not an acrostic. It's as if the writer couldn't do that anymore and just had to say a lot of other things that didn't actually fit in the alphabet, but it had to be dumped. Jeremiah describes the horrible situation they were in. The nation was in, if you think about the worst situation you've been in as a people, as a nation, as a city, I don't know if it can even compare with what Jeremiah was talking about. But here's some of the words he uses to describe the situation they're in. Verse 1, affliction, wrath. Verse 2, darkness. Verse 4, he says, my skin has wasted away. My bones are broken. Verse 5, we've been besieged. Verse 5, bitterness and tribulation. He says there's darkness in verse 6, and then it says it's like we're dead. That's pretty bleak. And then he talks about heavy chains in verse 7, and it goes on and on, this kind of language. He says that in verse 13 that He drove into my kidneys the arrows of his quiver. We're the laughing stock of all people, and we're taunted all day. And then he goes back and talks about bitterness more and describes it with the phrase wormwood. Every verse is just packed full of this bleak dark. From chapter 1, chapter 2, we're just looking at 3 today. But then the summary of all of this in verse 17 and 18 is there's no peace, there's no happiness, my endurance is gone, and there's no hope. No peace, no happiness, no way to endure anymore. And as a result, there's no hope. That's the picture that Jeremiah is painting in the book of Lamentations. In the middle of this horrible situation, we find these few verses of hope in the middle of the darkness. Verse 21 says, But, I call this to mind, and therefore I have hope. What does he call to mind? What does he mean here? He calls this to mind. I don't know if he thought all the way back to when he was a young boy, and we find that in Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 4 and 5, when God says, before you were even born, I called you to be a prophet to the nations. And then he describes what he was called to do. He was called to tear down, but also build up. He was called to point out the evil, but also to plant and to build. I can't imagine that Jeremiah assumed at that moment that most of his life would be in the tear down part. And most of his life would be in this dark, horrible situation. But there would only be a small season of planting and building. But that's how it turned out for Jeremiah. And then he gets to this, what he calls to mind, and it gives him such hope. In verse 22, what he calls to mind is, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. He recalls God's love and God's mercy. And God's love and mercy are described with the word never. They never cease. They never come to an end. No matter what is going on around us, God's love and God's mercy is real. No matter what's happening to us, God's love and God's mercy can be counted on. No matter what is happening in front of us, behind us, in our past, in our future, what's stable, what's consistent, what can be relied upon is God's love and God's mercy. And Jeremiah said, in the midst of all of this darkness and pain and injustice, he recalls and he remembers God's love and God's mercy, and that causes hope. He says that this love and mercy are new every morning. And then he says that classic phrase, great is your faithfulness. You know, when I read Scripture, I often have 2 questions in my mind. And the 2 questions are, what does this Scripture teach me about God? And secondly, what does this teach me about me, or about humanity, or about people? What does it teach us about God? Well, here's what it teaches about God is obvious. That in the midst of the darkness, in the midst of years of injustice and financial collapse and all the things that were happening to their city and their nation and everything around them, he called to mind God's love and God's mercy and God's faithfulness. And that gave him hope. There wasn't a political solution. There wasn't a business solution. There wasn't a military solution. But God's love and God's mercy and God's faithfulness gave hope. Now, that's what we learn about God. No matter what's going on, God still loves us. God is still merciful, and God is still faithful to his promises. It doesn't matter what we do. It doesn't matter what's done to us. That's how God is. That's who God is. That's how God acts. That's how God responds. But what about us? What can we learn about us? Verse 24 says a lot about us. And here's the statement. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I hope in him. The Lord is my portion. What does portion mean? That's the part you get. People talk about in the diet world, portion control. If you have small children, or sometimes with my grandchildren, there's a certain amount of strawberries or potato chips or whatever it is, and each one gets a portion. Sometimes somebody's trying to grab someone else's, but you have your portion. What is your portion? What is it? What Jeremiah says is, the Lord is my portion. Not my job is my portion. My ministry is my portion. My salary is my portion. My stuff is my portion. That's not it. Our portion, what we have, and sometimes it's the only thing we have, is God. And Jeremiah was at that place where his portion was the Lord. He really didn't have anything else. Everything else was taken unjustly, violently. Everything else was gone. And Jeremiah and the people of God around, they had nothing but the Lord. And so what Jeremiah says is, the Lord is my portion, says my soul. What does your soul say today? What does your soul need? What does your soul crave? I pray that we would be like Jeremiah. And no matter what else has been stripped away, because some people have, through the pandemic, some people have lost loved ones. People have died because of all the political unrest all around the world. I've spoken to people in multiple nations in the last few days, and there's political unrest, and it's different. It's racial in some places, it's justice issues in others. It's been such a variety, but yet it's rising up. And because of the political implications, some people have lost friends. People have lost lives. People have lost savings and finances. People have lost friends. People have lost their businesses, their jobs. But what does your soul say in the midst of that? Jeremiah's soul did not say, I've lost everything. His soul said, my portion, what I have now, what's mine, is the Lord. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I have hope. Therefore, I will hope. As long as the Lord is our portion, it doesn't matter what else is happening. We have hope. Now, what do we do? What do we do for the second half of 2020? First half has not been what any of us had hoped or prayed for or expected. It's not what any of us would want to relive. What about the second half and beyond? The next verse in 25 tells us a couple of things that we should do as people who have the Lord as our portion. Verse 25 says, the Lord is good to those who wait for Him, to the soul who seeks Him. And then in verse 28, and this is so powerful here, it says, let him sit alone in silence. Now, what should we do right now, today, tomorrow, the rest of this year and beyond? Number one, wait for God. Wait on the Lord. Number two, seek Him. Seek Him with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And number three, it says, sit alone in silence. There's some things that are only going to be resolved in our soul when we get alone with Him. Most of life is done in community. If we follow the life of Jesus, He intentionally and aggressively and regularly and routinely and had a rhythm of doing life with people. But then there were the occasions when He would go off alone with just the Father. I think when we go through something like many of us have been going through this year, there's this sit alone in silence thing. Not for the next 3 months or the next 3 weeks or the next 3 days, but there has to be time alone in silence, listening and hearing from God. And then we come out of that with a word from God, and we live that word out in community. So I'm not saying it's an either or, not an isolating, running from people, doing life with community, but getting alone with God to hear His perspective. Now, my hope is that we'll come out of this, not just with 2020 vision, just seeing the future like the average person. My hope is we'll come out seeing it a lot better, looking through Scripture, looking through that time with God, looking through our time when we sit alone and wait and seek Him and wait in silence until He speaks, and then we see better what He has for us, mainly by seeing more clearly who He is and how He responds to us. And I want to read one more verse. It says, for the Lord will not cast off forever. Verse 32, but though He can cause grief, He will have compassion according to the abundance of His steadfast love. It gets back to God's love. What do I learn about me in this? I need to seek God. I need to hear God. I need to get alone with God in silence. I need to wait on God. What do I learn about Him? No matter what's going on, His steadfast love, His mercy, and His faithfulness can be counted on. I wish it just ended there, but it doesn't. I wish once God showed up in the darkness, everything was okay now, but that's not the case. He goes back, the rest of chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5 is as dark and ugly and difficult as chapters 1 and 2 in the first half of 3. But here's the message. We can find God in the middle of it. You know that old thing people say, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying when life gives you lemons, find God. Press in. Hold on to Him. And when you hold on to God and realize that His steadfast love, His mercies, His faithfulness never end, then you find hope, even if it takes a little while longer for everything to be okay. Let your soul say today, the Lord is my portion.